It all started on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air bites just enough to remind you that summer has long passed and winter is lurking around the corner. I was sipping my coffee on the porch of my hand-built log cabin nestled deep in the woods of a quiet mountain community, a retreat I had poured my soul into over the last 5 years. Every beam, every nail, every stone in that place had a story. To me, it wasn't just a structure. It was my sanctuary from a world I had sworn to protect as a cop. Years of service, late-night shifts, courtroom testimonies, and the kind of trauma most people couldn't stomach had left me craving stillness. That cabin was my peace. The Homeowners Association, better known as the HOA, had always rubbed me the wrong way. Petty power trips, arbitrary rules, and a disturbing hunger for control. I had bought land just outside their jurisdiction, or so I thought. Months ago, I started getting letters, warnings, and then fines for violations I never agreed to. They claimed my cabin violated aesthetic uniformity. I claimed they had no authority. We were at a standoff. I assumed it would pass. I was wrong. The letters escalated. First it was about the color of my front door, non-compliant. Then it was about the gravel driveway, not up to community standards. Eventually they claimed my entire structure was unauthorized. I consulted the county office, confirmed my permits were in place, and ignored them. They had no legal reach here. At least that's what I believed. But these people weren't interested in facts. They were interested in dominance. I found out later that the HOA president, Gerald Cummings, had recently won a court decision expanding the HOA's reach to parcels that were originally exempt. Mine included. I never got the notice. I would have fought it. I should have fought it. But life had a way of piling things on. I was working back-to-back cases in the city, dealing with budget cuts and trying to hold together the last threads of a strained department. I let it slide. That was my mistake. Then came the bulldozers. It was a Sunday morning when I got the call. My neighbor Sheila, an elderly woman who baked pies and minded her business, was hysterical. "They're tearing it down, James?" I thought she meant someone broke in. But when I drove up the winding road, dust clouding the mountain air, I saw the truth. My cabin, my home, was being reduced to splinters by a bulldozer marked with the HOA's emblem. There were men in reflective vests laughing. One of them took a selfie with the wreckage. I saw Gerald Cummings standing there with a clipboard, sunglasses on, pointing as if he were directing a military operation. I don't remember getting out of the car. I just remember the blood pounding in my ears and my hand automatically going to my badge, not my gun. That came later. I identified myself. Detective James Wyatt, Metro PD. "You need to stop this now." Cummings smirked. "You're trespassing on HOA-enforced land. We have authorization." I asked for a warrant. He handed me a court order signed by a county judge I'd never even heard of. It was flimsy, misfiled, and full of procedural holes. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just overreach. This was a coordinated abuse of power. And unfortunately for them, they had just bulldozed the wrong guy's house. I didn't say another word. I didn't raise my voice. I just took photos. License plates. Names. Dates. I watched them finish the demolition with cold detachment. And then I got to work. Back in the city, I made a few calls. I knew which prosecutors owed me favors. I knew which judges hated the HOA's legal team. I pulled property records, financial transactions, and internal emails leaked by a disgruntled ex-HOA treasurer. What I found was staggering: unauthorized permits, embezzled funds, falsified documents, and bribery. They hadn't just bulldozed a cabin. They had built a criminal empire on intimidation and paperwork. So I built a case. Not just civil. Criminal. Federal. I worked after hours, on weekends, building the kind of airtight file that could sink a dozen careers. Because I wasn't just looking for compensation. I was looking for justice. The investigation wasn't easy, and it sure as hell wasn't quick. I kept it quiet, no leaks, no slip-ups. The HOA had connections, and if they caught wind of what I was doing too soon, they'd bury the evidence or disappear behind layers of legal protection. I started with Gerald Cummings, of course. Public records listed him as a retired real estate agent with no formal legal training, yet he'd filed over 30 small claims lawsuits on behalf of the HOA in the past 2 years alone. He'd won most of them, not because he was right but because the people he targeted didn't have the time, money, or know how to fight back. But I wasn't most people. I was trained to read between the lines, to connect dots, and to dismantle egos built on arrogance and legal loopholes. I submitted FOIA requests for every document tied to the HOA's litigation. Court records, permit logs, property liens, county clerk stamps, anything I could cross-reference I pulled and dissected. It turned out that the judge who signed the demolition order, Judge Klein, had been a longtime friend of Cummings. They played golf together weekly and had even co-hosted a charity barbecue for community development. That barbecue, as I discovered through campaign finance records, had quietly funneled contributions directly into Klein's re-election fund. Ethics violation number 1. Digging deeper, I found monthly consulting fees paid out from the HOA's reserve fund to an LLC called Pine Shadow Consulting. The LLC's address? A P.O. box in downtown Charleston. Registered agent? Linda Cummings, Gerald's wife. I ran the tax ID through the state's corporate registry and found it had never filed a single operational report. No office, no employees, no services rendered. Just checks. $2,500 a month, 12 months a year. Classic laundering. Meanwhile, emails leaked from a whistleblower, an ex-HOA treasurer named Louis Marston, revealed the board had been privately discussing my cabin for months. They hated that I hadn't followed the aesthetic vision of the neighborhood. The paint color, the wood exterior, even my porch swing had been labeled non-compliant. There was no Democratic vote. Just Cummings and 2 other board members rubber-stamping violations in closed-door meetings. Marston's emails were the smoking gun, proof of intent, collusion, and abuse of power. But I wasn't done yet. I needed to trace the money back further, find the pressure points, and make this more than just a local scandal. That's when I stumbled on something that took this case from petty HOA corruption to federal interest. An easement agreement buried in an old land registry file from 12 years ago. It revealed that part of the land my cabin sat on had been exempt from HOA governance under a grandfather clause signed by the original landowners and the county. The clause had been quietly removed from the public record through an illegal addendum filed after the fact. Again by someone connected to Cummings. That was forgery. Federal. I contacted a friend at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Not as a cop. As a private citizen reporting government fraud. I sent him everything, the emails, the bank records, the Shell LLC, the forged easement. It didn't take long for him to recognize the magnitude of the case. By the time I filed a formal complaint through Internal Affairs, 3 federal agents were already compiling their own file. Quietly. Deliberately. Thoroughly. Meanwhile I kept my poker face. I went to work every day, cracked jokes in the locker room, took my patrol shifts and pretended I was fine. But at night I'd go home, not to my cabin but to a motel room off the highway, where I stored boxes of evidence under the bed. Pictures of the demolition. Recordings of HOA meetings. Signed affidavits from neighbors too scared to speak out publicly. I had built a fortress of facts, and now it was time to drop the gates. Before launching the formal charges, I did one last thing. I filed a civil lawsuit for the wrongful destruction of private property. The media caught wind of it. The headline was glorious: Cop sues HOA over illegal bulldozing, federal probe launched. That was the first domino. And when it fell, the whole line began to topple. Cummings tried to go on the defensive. He claimed I'd threatened him. He tried painting me as a rogue officer with a vendetta. But the problem with lies is that they need support. And when the support collapses, they come crashing down hard. The fallout began slowly, like cracks in ice that suddenly spiderweb and shatter the whole surface. At first, the HOA acted as if nothing had happened. Their website remained live, full of hollow mission statements about community integrity and property value preservation. But behind the scenes, panic was setting in. I heard through channels that Gerald Cummings had hired a criminal defense attorney the moment he received the subpoena. His smugness had disappeared overnight. The media attention only intensified things. Local news vans began staking out the gated entrance to our mountain community. A reporter even tried to chase me down in the police department parking lot. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The documents I'd turned over were speaking volumes. Meanwhile, the rest of the HOA board started to distance themselves from Cummings, throwing him under the bus to save their own skin. 2 members resigned the same week. One of them, a retired school principal named Miriam Greer, filed an affidavit confessing that she had signed off on dozens of enforcement actions without reviewing them. She admitted she had relied entirely on Cummings' judgment. That was a costly mistake. The civil suit was progressing too. My lawyer, an old friend from my academy days who now specialized in municipal law, was a shark in court. He had subpoenaed the demolition crew and their foreman, who testified that they were hired under the impression that the order came from the county. When shown the documents, they admitted they never verified their legitimacy. That meant not only was the HOA liable for damages, but the contractor could potentially join my side as a co-complainant. The judge hearing our case, a federal magistrate with a reputation for hating overreach, didn't even hide his disgust when reviewing the forged easement files. He ordered an immediate injunction against the HOA, freezing all enforcement actions until the criminal case was resolved. Just like that, the group that once bullied homeowners with threats and fines had its power stripped away in one afternoon. Their silence on social media was deafening. Behind the scenes, the FBI had moved in. I wasn't involved in that part, by design. My contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office told me they were treating it as a white-collar crime investigation, which meant financial audits, subpoenas of HOA bank accounts, and interviews with everyone who had ever served on the board. I didn't know how far it would go, but I knew Cummings was in real trouble when I saw agents escorting 2 computers and several file boxes from his house one morning. He stood there in his bathrobe, blinking at the flash of cameras like a deer in headlights. The very man who orchestrated the destruction of my cabin was now watching his own house get picked apart, piece by piece. Justice was finally catching up. But this wasn't just about one man. This was about a system, a miniature tyranny disguised as a neighborhood management group. I wanted them all exposed. As the criminal case widened, I took it upon myself to support the other victims. I wasn't the only one they'd targeted. Over the years, the HOA had strong-armed dozens of homeowners into compliance through fines, liens, and legal threats. One couple had been forced to repaint their entire house 3 times in a single summer. Another family had their fence torn down while they were on vacation. A widow was threatened with foreclosure over garden gnomes. I started hosting quiet meetings at the local library, off the record, informal. I helped them understand their rights, their options, and how to organize. Many of them joined the lawsuit. Others wrote impact statements for the federal investigators. By the end of the month, I had nearly 24 people ready to testify against the HOA. What had once been a scattered group of intimidated homeowners was becoming a united front of pissed-off citizens. And I was proud to lead that charge. Some people warned me I was doing too much, making enemies I didn't need. Maybe they were right. I received 2 anonymous letters, both typed, telling me to let it go or watch my back. I turned them over to the investigators and added a camera to the dash of my truck. If they wanted to intimidate me, they'd have to do better than that. I wasn't the same man who built that cabin for peace. I was the man who now stood up for every neighbor too afraid to speak. And if the HOA wanted a war, they had picked the wrong soldier. But amid all the chaos, one thing burned in me more than anything: that cabin. My home. My safe place. Reduced to a heap of broken timber and shattered glass. No amount of legal victory could undo that loss. I visited the site once a week. Each time, I'd stand there in the open, looking at the scarred earth, and remind myself why I couldn't stop now. This was no longer just about rebuilding a home. It was about restoring what they thought they could take. My dignity, my voice, my sense of control. I didn't just want to beat them in court. I wanted to ensure they never did this to anyone again. By the time the federal indictments were handed down, the entire mountain community was holding its breath. The once feared HOA had become a punchline in local news segments and Reddit threads. But for those of us living through it, it wasn't funny, it was a slow, grueling vindication. Gerald Cummings was charged with wire fraud, falsifying legal documents, and conspiracy to commit municipal corruption. 3 other board members were charged with varying degrees of complicity, ranging from misuse of HOA funds to knowingly enforcing fraudulent citations. The judge, Klein, was suspended pending a formal ethics review, and word spread that he would likely face disbarment. I watched the headlines come in from my motel room where I still kept my gear and records, my own kind of war room. The irony didn't escape me. They destroyed my house trying to force me out of their community, and now they were the ones being driven out in shackles and shame. But it wasn't just about bringing people down. I was thinking ahead, about rebuilding. Not just my cabin but the very idea of community here. Several neighbors approached me, asking what it would take to form a new non-profit cooperative instead of a traditional HOA. I wasn't sure. I'm a detective, not a developer, but I promised to help. We began holding open forums, letting everyone speak, vote, and discuss. The relief was palpable. No more threats, no more anonymous letters, no more citations for mailbox height or fence colors. We were just people again. A neighborhood, not a battleground. And somewhere in all that rebuilding, emotionally and structurally, I started sketching plans for a new cabin. Not a replica of the old one. Something better. Stronger. A symbol of what it means to survive, not just wood and nails but defiance and purpose. Before I could lay the first foundation stone, the civil case finally reached trial. It had taken months of filings, interviews, and evidence submission, But the day came when we walked into federal court with boxes of organized documents, sworn affidavits, and legal firepower. Cummings and the remaining board members looked smaller in person. The arrogance that once radiated from them like cheap cologne had evaporated. My attorney opened with a slideshow, photos of my demolished cabin, time-stamped footage from a neighbor's drone, and overlays of false permits signed by the board. The jury didn't need much convincing. By day 3, even the judge appeared to have had enough. The final ruling awarded me full compensatory damages, enough to rebuild the cabin and then some. But more importantly, punitive damages were assessed against each defendant personally. That meant their homes, their savings, even their retirement accounts were now legally exposed. They had tried to destroy me through paperwork. I returned the favor, legally, thoroughly, and with all the restraint they lacked. After the trial, reporters begged for a statement. I gave only one: justice isn't revenge. It's restoration with accountability. Then I got in my truck and drove back up the mountain, the sun dipping behind the ridge like it always did, casting long shadows over the valley. The spot where my cabin had stood was quiet again. No construction noise, no legal wrangling. Just the wind, the trees, and a sense of finally being able to exhale. I brought with me a new set of blueprints. This time I wasn't building for solitude. I was building as a statement of recovery, of truth, of standing up when you're expected to fold. As I unrolled the plans on a makeshift table and started marking the land with survey flags, a few neighbors wandered up the trail. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. Their presence meant everything. One of them, Sheila, the elderly woman who had called me during the demolition, brought me a peach pie. "It's not justice," she said, "but it's something sweet after all that bitterness." I laughed for the first time in weeks. Not just a chuckle, a real chest-deep laugh. We sat on a fallen log and shared that pie like it was a victory meal. Maybe it was. It didn't erase what happened. But it reminded me of what still mattered: human decency, resilience, and community. Not the kind written in bylaws, but the kind built over cups of coffee, helping hands, and unexpected friendships forged through fire. In the weeks that followed, others began small renovations, planting gardens that once were forbidden, repainting their homes colors that actually made them happy. The landscape began to change, not just physically but emotionally. Fear no longer lived in these hills. People smiled more. Kids played outside longer. You could feel it, like someone had lifted a heavy curtain and let the light pour back in. And while I still had work to do, both as a detective and a man rebuilding his life, I knew one thing for sure: they would never make me feel small again. They tried to erase me. Instead, they taught me how to leave a bigger mark. The months that followed were the quiet kind, the sort of peace that only comes after a storm has passed and you've walked through it with your skin scraped but your spirit intact. Construction on the new cabin began mid-spring. I hired a crew of local carpenters, many of whom had heard my story and offered discounted rates or volunteered time. One of them, a young guy named Marcus, told me his father had once been fined by the HOA for flying the American flag on the wrong kind of pole. He shook his head and laughed like it was a joke, but I saw the anger in his eyes. "Building this place," he said, "feels like revenge in slow motion." I smiled. It wasn't about revenge, but I understood where he was coming from. Every swing of the hammer, every board lifted into place felt like justice being rebuilt from the ground up. This cabin wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to all of us who had been stepped on and silenced. As construction moved forward, I kept getting calls, from journalists, from other homeowners across the country, from legal advocacy groups. Apparently, the story had struck a national nerve. People were sick of being bullied by overzealous HOAs and saw in my case a kind of blueprint for resistance. I was invited to speak on a few news shows, but I turned most of them down. I wasn't interested in fame. But I did agree to speak at a community legal aid fundraiser downtown. I stood on a modest stage, still in my work boots and flannel shirt, and told the story plainly: no theatrics, just facts. I saw the crowd nodding, some with tears in their eyes, others clenching their jaws. Afterward, a woman approached me, clutching a folder filled with documents. Her HOA had placed a lien on her home for $87 in late fees. They were threatening foreclosure. "I didn't know who to turn to," she said, "until I read about you." I took her folder. "Now you do." Back in the mountains, the community was continuing to evolve. The old HOA had been formally dissolved by court order, its assets liquidated to pay restitution and fines. A new governing body, something we called the Neighborhood Circle, was formed, made up entirely of volunteers who rotated quarterly. No enforcement powers, no fines, just communication and cooperation. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. We built a simple website where neighbors could post announcements, lend tools, or offer help with repairs. A section of the old HOA office, now vacant, was turned into a free library and coffee hub. Sheila, bless her heart, organized weekly storytelling nights, where people brought food and shared everything from family recipes to ghost stories. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid to gather. No one was watching, reporting, or judging. It felt human again. As for the former board members, Cummings, Greer, and the rest, they disappeared from public view. Cummings was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, plus mandatory restitution. I didn't attend his sentencing hearing. I had seen enough of that man's face. I didn't need to see his fall. The others took plea deals, received probation, and were barred from holding any leadership roles in future housing communities. One of them, oddly enough, sent me a handwritten letter months later. No apology, just a kind of bewilderment. I didn't think we were doing anything wrong, it read. We were just following the rules. That was the problem, I thought. They had stopped asking whether the rules were just. And that's how tyranny begins, not with cruelty but with compliance. Rebuilding gave me purpose, but it also gave me perspective. I realized how fragile peace can be when power is concentrated in the hands of people who mistake control for order. I spent more time talking with neighbors than I ever had before, learning about their families, their struggles, their histories. One man, a veteran who lived at the edge of the property line, confessed that he'd been too afraid to speak up when the HOA started issuing threats. I've been through war, he said, but I didn't want to lose my home. That stuck with me. Fear doesn't always come from bullets. It can come from envelopes in the mailbox delivered with a logo and a warning. That's why I kept pushing for structural change even after the lawsuits were over. Because peace isn't just the absence of conflict, it's the presence of fairness. I wasn't the same man who had built that first cabin with hopes of a quiet life. That version of me had been seeking escape. This new version? He was wide awake, engaged, committed. I had become a reluctant activist, not by choice but by necessity. And somewhere along the way I realized that this fight was bigger than a cabin, bigger than one neighborhood. It was about power, voice, and the ability to live freely without fear of arbitrary punishment. The new cabin stood taller than the last. Not just physically but symbolically. I had carved into one of its beams a single word, burned into the wood by hand: resilience. Summer rolled in with the scent of pine and fresh sawdust still lingering in the mountain air. The new cabin was almost complete. A-frame design, double-insulated windows, stone fireplace. Modern touches but still rooted in the ruggedness of the old. This time I had installed a reinforced foundation, both literal and symbolic. I wasn't just building a home anymore, I was building a legacy. And people noticed. Neighbors stopped by with baked goods, iced tea, or just to talk. Many of them said the same thing: this place feels different now. And they were right. Something had shifted in our community. A curtain had been pulled back. The illusion of control, the grip of silent fear, both were gone. In their place, something better had begun to grow. Not just freedom but participation. People weren't just surviving here anymore, they were living, contributing, belonging. And that, more than anything, told me this fight had been worth it. I spent my evenings on the new porch, the same view but with a stronger frame beneath me. The sound of wind through the trees was the same, but I listened differently now, more attuned, more aware. Sheila would come by once a week with pie and stories. Marcus, the carpenter, would stay after work and talk about starting his own business. I offered to help with the paperwork. Even kids from nearby cabins began hanging around, helping with odd jobs, asking questions about tools, police work, or how to spot a lie in someone's eyes. I told them the truth: it's not about spotting lies. It's about listening to what someone doesn't say. They didn't always understand, but they listened, and that mattered. I wasn't just rebuilding myself, I was becoming part of something bigger, an ecosystem of accountability and care. The local sheriff's department, where I still served, started taking notice too. My captain, who had always been wary of personal crusades, invited me into his office one afternoon. "Whatever you stirred up out there," he said, "you've got the attention of the mayor's office. They're asking about community models." I raised an eyebrow. "You telling me we're a model now?" He smirked. "Don't let it go to your head, Wyatt, but yeah, people are watching." That's when it clicked. What started as a personal nightmare was turning into something instructive. Cities and towns around the state were suddenly interested in how to curb HOA abuse, how to implement checks, how to empower citizens. Lawyers were citing my case in housing disputes. Nonprofits were distributing copies of our court filings as a teaching tool. I hadn't meant to become an example, but maybe we needed more examples. But it wasn't all progress and inspiration. There were reminders of what had been lost. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, thinking I heard the crack of wood splitting or the roar of a bulldozer engine. I'd step out onto the porch and look at the dark outline of the forest, waiting for the silence to reassure me it was over. Trauma has its own echo, and it lingers long after the noise ends. Some days I'd catch myself driving past the old HOA office, now boarded up and slowly being reclaimed by vines and dust. The once pristine, obsessively manicured lawn was now overgrown. A fitting symbol. I never celebrated their fall because I knew how many people were hurt before someone finally said, "Enough." That thought humbled me, and it reminded me why I had to stay involved, not as a crusader but as a citizen who gives a damn. When the community held its first circle gathering, I was asked to speak. I almost said no. I'd said enough in courtrooms, depositions, and interviews. But something inside me urged me to stand again, this time not in defense but in reflection. So I stood on the same patch of grass where we used to dread seeing HOA board members gather with clipboards and attitude. I looked out at faces, familiar, free, smiling, and I said simply, "We are not the sum of what we lost. We are what we choose to build next." There was no applause. Just silence. The good kind, the kind that comes when people are really listening. That night, a bonfire lit up the mountain, and for the first time since this all began, I felt like I had come home, not to a structure but to a people. In the end, justice didn't come from a badge or a courtroom or even a victory in the press. It came from the slow, deliberate act of showing up. Every day. Helping a neighbor fix a fence. Sharing coffee on a porch. Pushing back when power overreaches. And listening, always listening, to the quiet voices that had been ignored for too long. That's what made the difference. Not my rank. Not my training. But my refusal to look away. That, I realized, is what community is supposed to be. A year later, almost to the day, I sat on the porch of my rebuilt cabin, now fully furnished and broken in, not just with furniture and decor but with laughter, stories, and a whole lot of healing. The view was just as I remembered, though maybe now I appreciated it more. The silence was no longer haunted, it was calm, earned. I watched as dusk wrapped the trees in golden shadow, and a few kids rode by on bikes, calling out to one another. The gravel road, once so strictly regulated by the HOA's arbitrary whims, now belonged to everyone. No citations. No fines. Just freedom. I held a cup of coffee in my hand, the same chipped mug that had survived the demolition found buried under a pile of rubble. I kept it as a reminder of everything that was lost, and everything I'd fought to reclaim. It sat now like a badge of honor, more valuable than any commendation I'd ever received on the force. Behind me, the living room buzzed with quiet voices. Sheila had brought over her famous cornbread, and Marcus was playing guitar softly while a couple of neighbors sorted through plans for a new hiking trail. What started as a small, informal gathering had become a weekly tradition. No agendas. No votes. Just people taking care of each other. We called it the table. Open to anyone who needed company, advice, or just a warm place to sit. The kind of thing you can't legislate, the kind of community no amount of rules could ever enforce. And in those moments I realized something profound. True order doesn't come from control, it comes from connection. The old HOA had tried to regulate behavior into submission. We had learned to organize ourselves around trust instead. The federal cases had long wrapped up. The story had mostly faded from the headlines, replaced by the next political scandal, the next celebrity meltdown, the next big thing. But in legal circles, our case was still talked about, a turning point in how communities could fight back against weaponized bureaucracy. I'd occasionally get a letter from someone across the country, a father in Texas whose HOA threatened him over a trampoline, a widow in Oregon fined for planting native wildflowers, a veteran in Michigan who felt hopeless until he saw what we had done here. I couldn't fix everything for them, but I could listen. I could point them in the right direction. And sometimes that was enough. Hope, like justice, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to show up. My department gave me a commendation, not for any one act but for exemplary service to the community both on and off duty. It was a quiet gesture and I appreciated it. But the real reward had come in the form of something less tangible. Peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from walking on eggshells under someone's thumb, but the kind that grows when you fight for the right reasons and win, not out of vengeance but out of love. Love for truth. Love for people. Love for the idea that no one, no matter how small or quiet, should be made to feel powerless in their own home. And now, as the sun slipped fully behind the mountains and the stars blinked into existence above the treetops, I took a deep breath and let the cool evening air fill my lungs. I wasn't just a cop anymore. I was a neighbor, a builder, a survivor. And this cabin, once reduced to wreckage, now stood taller than ever, not because of its size, but because of the story it held in every nail and board. It was proof that injustice, no matter how loud or well-dressed, could be dragged into the light and held accountable. That good people, when given the chance and the will, could rewrite the rules they'd been forced to live under. The HOA had thought they were dealing with just another homeowner. Just another name on a list. Just another violation to stamp and crush. What they didn't realize, what they never bothered to ask, was who I really was. I wasn't just a badge. I was a fighter. A believer in the law when it serves the people, not when it bullies them. And most of all, I was someone who refused to be erased. So, as the last laugh of the evening echoed through the trees and the fire pit crackled behind me, I raised my mug to the darkness, not in anger, not in mourning, but in gratitude. For survival. For justice. For community. And for the stubborn, unshakable truth that some things, like home, like dignity, like freedom, are worth fighting for.